Okay. So here is our subject property and our offer instructions for today's offer practice. And I'm not sure if anybody had an opportunity to take a look at this prior to this afternoon. But what I like to do during offer practice is just walk through our subject property very quickly. I'll go through the offer assumptions. And then I've already filled out the necessary documents that we would include with our offer packet. So you can kind of use that as an answer key and you can fill it out as we move along. But our subject property here is 1108 Eastbrook Drive in Burlington. So I'm just gonna pull that up in, what am I doing? In MLS. And can you guys see the listing information here on the screen? Just want to make sure you can still see my screen. Okay, what do we got here? Perfect. Okay. So we've got a cutie patootie little ranch here in Burlington. It's a 3-bed, 2-bath. It's been on the market for a couple of weeks. One thing to note, how I like to look at the MLS data sheets is really like the first place that I take a peek at is the private remarks to see if there's anything interesting or informative that might help me craft my offer. So right out of the gate in private remarks, it's just talking about measurements to be verified, sellers related to the listing agent, which is important to note. And then attorney's title is actually going to hold the earnest money. See offer instruction. So, oh my gosh, we already have another wonderful thing to look at, and that's documents. There's a seller condition report, and then there's offer instructions. I think if I show you offer instructions, I don't think you guys can actually see that PDF anymore. So maybe this is a great place to go into MLS yourself and take a peek. But really the offer instructions talks about binding acceptance, time frame, closing time frame, how earnest money should be delivered, and then offer delivery. So that's always, again, the first place that I kind of take a peek when I'm looking at a listing, just to get a little bit of inside information. So what I'm going to do is really go back now to our instructions sheet. So our buyer profile, so our buyer is Roger Goodell. Does anyone know who Roger Goodell is? I always try to use somebody like kind of like timely. Okay. Roger Goodell is the commissioner for the NFL. And does anyone know what's happening later this week in Green Bay? The NFL draft. No, not the playoffs. Okay. So Roger Goodell is our buyer, and he signed a buyer agency with us last week. And in that buyer agency agreement, he agreed to our 2.4% compensation, and our agreement is valid for 60 days. So because he signed a buyer agency with us, that makes him our client and not a customer. So that'll be important when we get to the offer. He's got a flexible closing time frame. He does want to have a home inspection and a radon inspection. He's been pre-approved for up to 550 with a local lender, and that loan type that he is going to be securing is a 30-year conventional loan. He's got 15% to put down, and then right now the pre-approval we'll say is for a 7.3% mortgage rate. If you don't know any of your buyers' financial or mortgage information or pieces of mortgage information, like how much they're putting down, how much should we be using for interest rate, it's okay to, and you should be picking up the phone and calling the lender that the buyer is using, because you want to make sure that you're using some accurate information. So some assumptions for our offer. The seller has preferences based on the offer instructions document that they had uploaded into MLS. If there wasn't any type of document in MLS, I would also be picking up the phone and calling the listing agent just to see if there is any other information that the seller is looking for that could help make your offer a little bit stronger. So the seller in the offer instruction sheet indicated they were asking for 48 hours of binding acceptance. They wanted to close as soon as possible. And we're going to pretend that I called the listing agent, and this week I actually didn't. So we're going to pretend that I called the listing agent and we did have a little conversation just about seller preferences. And in that conversation, we're going to pretend that she shared with me the seller is willing to pay 2.4% commission to the buyer's agent, and you can just write it into the offer. So our instructions for the offer are pretty straightforward, clear cut. This isn't competitive offer practice. This is truly just blocking and tackling, good old offer practice that'll hopefully help teach you some of the fundamentals to the document. So our offer price is going to be $459.9, and that's actually what they're asking. We're going to take all of the inclusions that the seller has indicated will be part of the sale as noted in MLS. And the same holds true for the exclusions. Whatever the seller has indicated is going to be excluded from the sale will follow along with that as well. Now, your buyer in real life might not want everything that is included, or maybe the buyer wants to add something in addition to what is being communicated or being marketed as an inclusion. It's okay for you to have those conversations. So just because the seller says something doesn't necessarily mean you have to like follow it, but there might be some things that your buyer doesn't want, and there might be some extra things that the buyer does want. So just make sure you're pretty crystal clear with asking the buyer as you're starting to draft your offer. We're going to have a closing date of May 22nd. Roger's going to be providing 3% in earnest money. So in our market, it's pretty typical for 1 to 3% to be given as earnest money if the offer is accepted. So I put it on the higher end, the 3%. And we know that he wanted to have a home inspection, and we're going to give the seller the right to cure. That's very common in our market today. And he does have a little bit of a threshold. He's okay with taking on up to the first $2,500 in repairs that are noted in the home inspection. So when we get to that part of the offer, I'll kind of go a little bit more into detail there. But he'd like to have the radon tested. He will have an appraisal contingency. We know he's getting financing, so it's going to be contingent on a loan. And then we're also going to add as the final contingency that the seller is going to compensate the buyer's firm, so our 2.4%. So something I always want to make sure people realize too, this closing time frame is 30 days. So it's fast, but it's very feasible. It's something though that you want to make sure that you are taking into consideration when you start looking at your contingency deadlines. So we don't want to have a lot of deadlines at like 15, 20 days if our closing is going to be in 30 days, right? So when we get to the offer, I'll show you how I would kind of navigate this type of time frame. So if I go into zip forms, and this isn't going to be necessarily a zip form training, but I already have the offer filled out, so you can kind of use it as an answer key. But the first document that I always fill out as part of my offer is the main document, that residential offer to purchase, the WB11. So here we go. So I clicked in the box and I've indicated the date that we're drafting the offer, which is today. And you'll notice I crossed off the options that are found in line 2. So I crossed off agent of seller and listing firm and agent of buyer and seller. And I crossed those off because Roger, our buyer, has signed a buyer agency agreement with us, which makes us his agent. So when I cross these things out, the new line reads, licensee drafting this offer on April 22nd, 2025 is the agent of the buyer. So I've crossed off the other options. I've typed in the buyer's name here, the address for the property. And then in line 6, you have to indicate what type of municipality, the city or town or village or whatever it is, for that municipality name. So if you don't know, and many times you might not know the specifics, go back to MLS. And here in MLS, kind of in the middle of the data sheet, you'll see that there's a line that says municipality. And the listing agent has inputted the municipality type. So it could be city, town, village. I really don't know what other options exist besides those 3. There's probably more, but I have no idea. So I have put then in my offer that 1108 Eastbrook Drive is in the city of Burlington. Okay. And then that's in the county of blank. If you don't know the county immediately offhand, you can go back to MLS, and there at the top of the data sheet is the county name. So 1108 Eastbrook Drive in Burlington is actually in the county of Racine. So I've put that here in the county of Racine. Now, in terms of price, we're going to be offering what they're asking. And all I've done here is literally typed in the 459.9 into line 10. And Zip Forms will automatically populate the line above it with the full written out version. So let's just pretend like we are doing 450. So then you can see how line 10 or 9 changed after I inputted line 10, but I'm going to be doing this. Okay. Now, in our offer instructions, we indicated that we're going to be including everything that the seller was willing to offer and that was noted in MLS. So I literally went to MLS. I went to the inclusions. I copied and I literally pasted and put it into the inclusions here in lines 12 and 13. And one thing that I want to note, you'll see here at the end, they indicated that the water softener is owned. Usually when you have like water softeners or iron filters, if the property is on a well, you'll have some of these additional items that will help with water treatment. Sometimes those are owned and sometimes those are rented. It's a great thing to pick up the phone and ask the listing agent if these things are in fact owned or rented. If they're rented, they will not come with the home. But your buyer can always carry on the rental agreement post-closing with that company if they see fit. But just make sure you clarify. I see I have something in the thing. Sorry to be late. Oh, no problem, Teresa. Okay, now our exclusions are really just the seller's personal property, and that's what's indicated in MLS as well. So for me, Zip Forms automatically puts seller's personal property here in line 20, but it's also kind of repetitive because the document, the offer to purchase actually includes that language as well. I'm going to move down to binding acceptance. So we know that in our offer instructions sheet that the listing agent uploaded into MLS, the seller was asking for 48 hours binding acceptance. So I'm pretending that I'm going to be sending this offer over today. 48 hours from now, it's going to be, Thursday, April 24th. If you did in fact want to have a specific time frame on your deadline, so say I want to know by 6 p.m. on April 24th, you can do that. Most certainly can do that. Otherwise, just note, if you don't specify a time, that deadline goes through 11:59 p.m. on that date that is in the offer. And that holds true too for all deadlines. Everything goes until 11:59. Now, closing is going to take place on May 22nd. This was just included in our offer instructions. And it's my Zip Forms automatically populates line 48 with at a place selected by the buyer. It's very common for the buyer and the buyer's lender to come, make that decision. So I've crossed off here at the place selected by the seller so as to not have any kind of contradictory information. Okay, moving to the top of page 2, and I'm glad this worked or didn't work because this is a perfect example. We have to make sure when we get now to the subsequent pages, the address at the top of each page needs to be populated to match the address that is found on page 1. And for some reason, Zip Forms said that this was going to be in the city of Racine, and it's not. It's going to be in the city of Burlington. And the zip code is correct. So all I have to do is change it once on page 2. And if I do a quick spot check, here it is correct on page 3. So back up to this page, we know that our buyer, Roger, is going to be offering earnest money. And earnest money is typically provided after the offer is accepted. So you'll note here, earnest money of blank, and it says not applicable, accompanies this offer. That means we're giving them the earnest money right now. The Zip Forms automatically says not applicable. You can change it if you'd like, but the most common thing that you'll see in offers is that earnest money will be sent within blank days after acceptance. So I noted on our offer instructions that we're going to be giving 3% of the purchase price. So 3%, and I'm just going to do my double check. 3% of 459.9 is $13,797. So I just rounded it to 13,800. And again, that is going to be either mailed, electronically sent, which would be through trust funds. And that's actually what the listing agent has indicated in their offer instructions is the preferred vehicle for earnest money to be delivered. Or you can personally deliver it by dropping off the check at the correct location. I've put here that we're going to do this within 3 days. If you don't put anything in that line, it'll automatically default to 5. But one thing that I want to make sure everybody understands is that we have a little bit of manipulating to do here on line 60. All earnest money shall be delivered to and held by, and I've kept other identified. Other identified is the attorney's title and closing services that was indicated in the offer instruction sheet. Usually, or I should say usually, the overwhelming majority of times, the listing firm is actually the firm that holds the earnest money. But you'll see some smaller brokerages or even some agents that choose to work with a title company to help hold that money. So that's why I've indicated the title company's name and I just put the street address here. But sometimes, or I should say, sometimes overwhelming majority of the times, you'll see the offer like this, that all earnest money shall be delivered to and held by the listing firm. But for ours today, we're going to move that on over. Then this section of the offer really talks about earnest money and what happens if the transaction doesn't come to close, what happens to the earnest money. So please make sure that you take a look at this section and familiarize yourself with it. But then the next section here that we have to be aware of is the condition report. So the state requires every seller to fill out a condition report to the best of their knowledge if they have lived in the home. There might be situations where a seller refuses to complete a condition report. Maybe they're selling it on behalf of their parents in a trust or as a personal representative, and they've never lived in the home. Regardless of whether or not, or regardless of why they are not filling out the condition report, a seller will be then required to fill out a different document called like the seller's refusal to complete a condition report. But our sellers provided one, and we have to acknowledge the fact that we are in receipt of the property condition report. And that's what this section does, it outlines here. So seller represents to the buyer that as of the date of acceptance, the seller has no notice or knowledge of conditions affecting the property other than those identified in the condition report. You've got to put the date here for the condition report, and you can get that information off of MLS because the condition report has been uploaded to the documents. So our condition report was dated back on March 3rd. No modifications need to be made to the third page. So we're going to get over here to the top of page 4, and this really brings us into more the meat and potatoes of our inspections and testing. So we know that our buyer wants to have a home inspection. And remember, a home inspection is different than a test. And the differences are actually outlined here in this section. But an inspection is a visual observation of the property. A test is actually where somebody takes something off of the property, like a sample, and tests it. So when we check this box in line 193, we are indicating that our offer is contingent upon the home being inspected by a licensed home inspector. So it's not necessarily testing. Now, if your buyer, let's say you guys noticed during the showing that there might be some basement issues or maybe evidence of water in the basement, you don't know because you're not an expert, but maybe right out of the gate, not only does your buyer want to have a home inspection, but maybe they also want to have the basement inspected. You can write those additional inspections here in these blank lines in 197 and 198. Just note that, that as a seller, seeing that, it makes a buyer's offer look less attractive. But if that is something that your buyer really wants to have inspected, in addition to the general home inspection, you certainly can write it into the offer. But you have to be specific. This also indicates that the buyer can have follow-up inspections based on a written report if they so choose. This also indicates that the buyer shall order the inspection and are responsible for the costs. Now, the contingency is satisfied within blank days. This number of days isn't necessarily the number of days you have to have the home inspection. This number of days represents you have to have the home inspection, you have any follow-up inspections, or you gather estimates based on if your buyers do want to have those follow-ups. But you also, if there are things that you're trying to negotiate, like repairs or an adjustment in price, all of that has to be done within these 10 days. So I just want to make that clear, like this number of days here doesn't mean you have 10 days to have the home inspection. This means you have to have the home inspection, follow-ups, and any negotiations signed, sealed, and delivered in an amendment. So if I just read the line or the section here, so the contingency is deemed satisfied unless the buyer within, I put 10 days. If you leave it blank, it's 15. After acceptance, delivers to the seller a copy of the written inspection report dated after the date, so today's date, and a notice indicating defects in a report. So what does all this mean? If, for example, and one thing too, I put 10 days. 10 days is, I would say, a standard time frame right now for home inspections, but let's remember too, our closing is in 30 days. Typically, the home inspection time frame is the most stressful period of the transaction. It's also kind of the busiest, right? Because we might be needing to get follow-ups, what have you. Waiting 15 days when we have a 30-day close, I don't like getting to half of that kind of transaction time frame. I'd rather try to get this done sooner versus later, but also try to give myself and my buyers enough time to get this stuff done. So I think 10 days is totally fair. Lately, I've personally been writing into offers like 7 or 8 days, but that means you got to hustle. So say, let's keep using the basement as the example. Say a basement expert came in and said, we need to put beams in the basement and that's going to cost $10,000. And say your buyers they don't have $10,000 to do it, and they actually want the seller to do it before closing. So we're trying to negotiate verbally between the two parties. And what I like to do is before I send over an amendment requesting things in writing, I like to give the listing agent a call just so there are no surprises. But say we're trying to negotiate that the seller fixes, or adds the basement beams, and we want it done within 3 days prior to closing. We send that over in an amendment, because if both parties sign the amendment, that means that it is official and we have agreed to the terms. Well, let's say the seller won't put the basement beams in before closing, but maybe the seller is willing to give a $10,000 adjustment in price. And then it's on the buyer to determine whether or not that they want to put the beams in. That's another way to cure. So, in terms of curing, it could be repairs, it could be credits, it could be price adjustments. But just note that you've got to figure all of that out within this number of days. If we get to say day 9 and we don't have a signed amendment in place indicating what's going to happen, now we're kind of getting down to crunch time, and you have to have a conversation with your buyer as to whether or not you're ready to issue a notice of defect. And sending a notice, which only has to be signed by the initiating side, sending a notice of defect is a way for your buyer to kind of put it all on the line. Like, all of these things need to get fixed. It might not even just be the roof anymore. It might be other things that were in the inspection report. And now the seller's on the hook to answer. So we have a whole inspection contingency training. on YouTube after this. I'll send you guys, a link to that training because I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this. But it's probably the most important contingency that you understand, as well as can be the most stressful and confusing if you don't. So you have a lot of resources at your disposal to really kind of master this. At the end of the day too, if you're ever in a situation where you need help and you're not quite sure how to navigate this part of the transaction, by all means, pick up the phone, call the helpline, call your PC coach, call your compliance broker, and we're all here to help you.
Will you scroll up really quickly to
Yeah.
193?
193.
Okay.
Check the box. Real quick question or comment. If you don't want to add the contingency to your offer, rather than leaving this blank, I think it's best practice to put NA, not applicable. But by checking this box, this means the offer is contingent upon us having a home inspection. Now down on line 216, we are going to give the seller the right to cure. And this is pretty common right now in our market. It has been for several years since we're still in a seller's market. But giving the seller the right to cure kind of puts the decision in their court. And they can choose to do it or they can choose not to. If they choose not to, what happens? And it's all written right here in black and white. So let's just quickly read it. If the seller has the right to cure, they can satisfy the contingency by delivering a notice back to the buyer. And I put within 2 days. I don't want to give a lot of time here. Time is of the essence. So they can send a written notice back to the buyer within 2 days after the buyer initially sent them that notice, indicating they're going to cure the defects. They can cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner. And then they got to give a report to the buyer indicating the work that was done, and all of that has to be provided within 3 days prior to closing. Or the offer could be dead, null and void, if the buyer sent a notice of defect along with that home inspection report, and you should send the home inspection report to the listing agent. You should not send the home inspection report to the lender, but it's okay to send it to the listing agent. So offer is null and void if the buyer sends the notice of defect and that inspection report and the seller never had the right to cure to begin with. Deal is dead. Your buyer had the upper hand in the situation. Or the offer is dead if the seller had the right to cure, but they came back and said, we're not going to cure. Or the deal is dead. The seller had the right to cure, but they didn't get back to us within those 2 days, indicating what they were going to do. So again, familiarize yourself with the language. Joan Reed always says all of your answers to your questions are right there in black and white in the documents, and she's not lying. I mean, I would never call Joan a liar, but she's not lying. Moving on to the radon test. So a lot of home inspectors can actually do a radon test at the same time as the home inspection. They'll leave a kit in the basement. They'll come back in a couple of days to pick it up. But I like to make my time frame match my home inspection. So if we gave ourselves 10 days to have the home inspection figured out, then I'm going to give myself 10 days to have the radon test figured out. And I also, if you notice here, I'm indicating that the buyer is going to pick up the expense. If you don't strike one, the buyer is automatically picking up the expense. But let's say that report came back and we have radon levels in excess of 4.0. What happens? Well, a lot of the information here or language is very similar to what we saw in the home inspection. So who is going to have the right to cure? Right now in our market, it's very customary to give the seller the right to cure the radon test. How does the radon test get cured? If it comes in high, usually it's by installing a radon mitigation system. So that's all written out here, but the deal is dead if the buyer gave a notice to the seller and the seller never had that right to cure anyways. Or the deal is dead if the seller has the right to cure, but they send a notice back indicating they're not going to cure. Okay, so make sure you just familiarize yourself with the language. Moving into financing, so our buyer's getting a loan. So I've checked the box in line 248, meaning our offer is contingent upon them getting a written loan commitment. And you put the loan type here in line 249. So our buyer is getting a 30-year conventional. I put that in our line. If they were getting an FHA, a VA, an adjustable rate mortgage, you would put the loan type here. And in terms of our deadline, so we're indicating we are going to have our loan commitment from our lender. We're going to have that within 21 days. I like to give myself maybe like a week between financing and closing, just a little bit of breathing room. You could extend this if you wanted to maybe like 25 days. But, you know, in terms of making your offer more attractive, a quicker financing deadline is always going to be, you know, something that a seller will like. But what you want to make sure is you don't overpromise and underdeliver. Call the lender and confirm that they can make these types of deadlines. 21 days right now is pretty standard. You know, 14 days is becoming a little bit more standard. I got a loan commitment in 11 days last week. So it's possible, but you need to make sure that you're in constant communication with the lender. And I would just always ask before you put it in writing, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Lender, is this feasible? Now, the amount of money that our buyer is getting financed needs to go in line 251. So this isn't the purchase price, but what this represents is the purchase price minus his down payment. So it's called the principal. This is the principal loan amount. This is what we're actually getting a loan amount for. So again, it's the asking price. I'm sorry, offer price minus the down payment. And we know that Roger is putting 15% down. So what I'm gonna do is I use a mortgage calculator to help me figure out this section. And I use Carl's mortgage calculator, Carl with a K, because it's the easiest thing. And I plug in 15%, I plug in the property value, and then I plug in our interest rate of 7.3%. And that spits out a monthly amount that Roger's going to be on the hook to pay as it pertains to his mortgage. Okay, so that's what you put here. This is going to be his monthly principal and interest. Now, make sure you tell your buyers too, as you're walking them through this document, this isn't going to be your monthly amount that you're on the hook for. This just represents your mortgage. So you acknowledge, Mr. Buyer, Roger, that the lender might also include taxes every month. They might include homeowners insurance every month. So that all gets rolled into their monthly payment. So sometimes buyers see this amount and they're like, oh, I was budgeting for so much more. Like this is a steal. This just represents the amount that is going to be required for the buyer to pay every month for their monthly principal and interest. Now we're getting a fixed rate mortgage, meaning it's going to be the same interest rate for the duration of the loan. So I've checked box 264 and I've put what our interest rate was here, 7.3. If you don't know what the interest rate is, that's fine. Call the lender and ask them what you should use in the offer. If your buyer was getting an ARM or an adjustable rate mortgage, you'd be checking box 265. And I would probably have the lender help you fill this section out because adjustable rate mortgages vary based on every year there could be a different mortgage rate. So that's where I would get some help here. But then the bottom of this page just talks about what does it mean to satisfy the financing contingency? What do you have to do? At the bottom, there is an option for seller financing, meaning the seller is going to help the buyer. In our situation, we're not doing that. So we put NA, not applicable. If your buyer was actually paying for the home with cash and not getting a loan, you wouldn't have filled out that financing section. But what you would fill out here is if the offer isn't contingent on financing, within blank days, the buyer is going to deliver to the seller a reasonable written verification from a financial party or an institution saying they have the funds. So this is just saying within X amount of days, the buyer is going to deliver to the seller a proof of funds indicating they have the cash on hand. If I'm writing a cash offer, I'm not putting 7 days here. I'm not putting 3 days here. I'm actually giving my proof of funds along with the offer in a similar fashion as to how I would include a pre-approval letter. So I would put 1 day here. Moving into the appraisal contingency, we know that our buyer would like to have this contingency included in the offer. So by checking box 308, this doesn't mean that the lenders just were asking to have an appraisal. This actually specifies with a little bit more language and rigor what happens or what are our options if the house actually doesn't appraise for the value that we're buying it for. So say, and I'm just gonna round it, we're buying this house for 460, or we offered 460. Well, what happens if the appraiser comes in and says it's worth 450? We got a $10,000 difference. We are indicating in here, if the value comes in less than an agreed upon purchase price, and the buyer sends a written notice objecting to that appraised value, we're gonna give the seller the right to cure. Meaning, we're gonna probably negotiate with the seller to help get that number, the purchase price, down to the appraised value. And why that's important is more than likely your buyer's not gonna be able to get a loan for that original amount because the appraiser's telling the lender the house isn't worth that. So again, this kind of brings some more structure around what can happen in the event the house doesn't appraise. And usually giving the seller the right to cure is 99% of the time going back to the seller and saying, hey, the house didn't appraise, can you please drop the price? Now, if the house appraised at 470, so it's higher than what we were buying it for, you do not give the appraisal report to the other agent. You just say the value looks good, we're moving on. But you do give the appraisal report to the other side if the purchase or the appraised value comes in low, because they need to have proof, right? We're gonna give the seller the right to cure. That's very common in our marketplace today, and we're gonna give our seller 2 days to get back to us if we do need to negotiate. A lot of the information here in the offer is null and void, looks very similar to what we just saw in the home inspection contingency. So make sure you read that. If Roger, our buyer, had to sell his current house in order to buy the new house, we'd be checking this box 328, meaning the offer is contingent upon the buyer closing on the sale of his house, and we'd have to put in the address. But we're not gonna make it complicated today. And we are not also then gonna have a bump clause because usually this accompanies the home sale contingency. This isn't a secondary offer, meaning we are writing to be in primary position. You would know if you were writing as a secondary offer because another offer would have already been accepted. So we're putting NA here. Moving along in terms of prorations, we have to give the title company some direction as to how taxes will be prorated between the two parties. And the most common one here is line 366, meaning taxes are going to be prorated based on the amount from the preceding year. You don't have to figure out the math, but you do have to give direction to the title company. If you aren't quite sure, maybe it's new construction and taxes were different, or maybe there was like a huge addition to a house, or I don't know, or you had the zoning changed and the taxes might be different. If you have questions as to which option you should put here, just call your compliance broker or the helpline, and they can help figure that out for you. This section here talks about title, what title is, and what title, who pays for title and all that stuff. So make sure you read through that. I'm just gonna breeze past it. There's a bunch of definitions here within the document on page close, so make sure people know that. Occupancy happens at the time that closing happens, so buyers get the keys. Buyer owns the house and can take occupancy unless maybe there's some post-closing occupancy that is being offered, or perhaps it's a rental property and there's going to be a lease in place. These sections here talk about default and what happens if either party isn't able to make the commitments that are outlined in the document. Remember, you're not a lawyer and you cannot give legal advice. So if you're ever in a situation where you think things are getting a little bit dicey, that's the time to call the compliance broker in your office and get their insight as to what steps you should be taking next. And then here on page 10 is our final contingency within the main offer document. I've checked the box 543 indicating that the seller agrees to pay the buyer's firm 2.4% of the purchase price. So this is our commission, right? We have talked to the listing agent. The listing agent said you can write it right into the offer. So that's what we've done. And then you'll notice there's some language here in the blank lines. My zip forms automatically populates with this information. So if any contingency deadline falls on a Saturday, Sunday, holiday, the deadline automatically goes to the next business day. The only time that doesn't pertain is when we have binding acceptance. Binding acceptance can happen 365 days a year. And then I also added some language here. So we had a home inspection and we were giving the seller the right to cure. What I've done here is added some language around, well, how does that need to work? And you can find this language by hitting the clause button. We have 22 clauses that our attorneys have approved for us to use, and they're the most common additions that agents put in some of these blank lines. So familiarize yourself with some of them because they can come in handy and they can come in super handy in a pinch. But here's the right to cure. I literally just took this information, I copied it, and I put it here. And then the last thing I've added, because this is important, and the listing agent did the right thing by indicating the seller is related to the listing agent. So we want to make sure that our buyer is aware of that as well. We don't want anyone saying, oh, that was kind of shady. They're representing their mom or their dad or their grandma or their grandpa. So I've just indicated here, buyer understands that the seller is related to the listing agent. Then I've put down here, how are we going to deliver documents? I've put the email address for the seller. That is actually the listing agent's email address. Email address for the buyer is your email address. Within our offer, we're also going to be attaching a couple of addenda. So I've listed those here, GMAR Addenda A, GMAR Addenda AC. Who drafted the offer? Well, I did, so I'm putting my name and my brokerage. And that's all you have to put for the offer. So I'm going to hit back, and now I'm going to go into Addendum A, because that's going to be another document that we are going to include in our offer. And Addenda A can be used for a variety of things. If you were asking for a closing cost credit, if you wanted the seller to buy a home warranty, if the house was on a private well and you wanted to have the well or well water tested, or maybe they have a private sanitary system like a septic tank. This is the document that you use to add all of those contingencies to. But for ours today, and a lot of times, the only box that you check on this addenda is at the very bottom, and that's what's happening today. So we're not asking for seller credits. We're not asking for a home warranty. We are not getting any additional tests done. We're not having the well tested, the water tested, the private sanitary system tested. We're not getting a VA loan. So the only thing that I'm checking on this document is box 203, lead paint. And actually, let's make sure there even was a lead paint. Nope, there wasn't. So we don't even have to check that box. Let's pretend the house was built before 1978. We have the lead paint addenda. So then the other information that I have on here is the firm information for the buyer, which is your information. And then the firm information for the seller is the listing agent's information. And you can get all of this off of MLS down here at the bottom. Their address, the license number for the agent, the license number for the office, it's all right there. Okay, I'm going to go back. And then the final document that we're going to use is Addendum AC. And Addendum AC is becoming a lot more frequently used because it covers three things. It's a short document, but it's a helpful document. And it covers off on, again, I mentioned three things. The first one being if your buyer is willing to take on a little bit of the repair work that might be identified out of the inspection. It's used if your buyer has some extra cash on hand and can cover a bit of a difference if there is a gap between the offer price and the appraised price. And then it's also used if we have an escalation clause, meaning your buyer is submitting an offer at this price, but if another offer comes in higher than your buyer's offer, your buyer might be willing to go in increments of $2,000. I'm just using as an example, but your buyer is willing to go up to an even higher price, but there is a maximum. But for our practice today, our buyer indicated because he wanted to have an inspection, he also wanted to indicate that he was okay taking on any repairs for the first like $2,500. And again, this doesn't mean that he's going to be fixing those things between now and closing. What that just means is he's willing to take on those costs or those repairs after closing. But anything that might cost more than $2,500, he's going to be, asking to negotiate with the seller. So this actually makes your buyer's offer a little bit more attractive to a seller if you have a home inspection contingency. Note for a buyer, it can be a good thing, but the higher the dollar amount, the more that your buyer then is willing to take on. So, and it doesn't have to be like one item. You can add a bunch of items together, but just note that the higher amount here is more attractive to the seller, but that means that your buyer is willing to take on more of the work. Okay? So here it's also indicating that estimates need to be gathered from qualified people. If there is a cost associated with getting an estimate, buyer's responsible for it. Now, the parties also agree, and this is why this document's nice, because it kind of lays things out in black and white. The parties may together agree on the cost to repair or replace the defects. Estimates obtained are utilized only for execution and does not necessarily affect the seller's right to cure. Now, I always check this box. By checking this box, this means not only is the buyer going to be getting estimates, I'm okay giving the seller the right to have his people come in too. For me, that the more information, the better, and the more information could be very helpful to your buyer. So this just indicates the seller can also get estimates. It also states that if a buyer's estimate is different than the seller's estimate, so let's go back to our basement example. Say we had somebody come in and they told us it was going to be $10,000 to put in basement beams. Maybe the seller's person came in and said, no, it's not going to cost 10 grand. It's going to cost 7. What do you do? It talks right here that either party, wait, where did it go? Both parties agree that they will average the estimates. So that's kind of nice. It kind of takes a little bit of mystery out of it. But then by checking this box in line 25, this also gives either party the opportunity to extend that original home inspection contingency by a few more days. So I put 5 here. 5 is the standard. Now, one thing to note, just by checking this box, it doesn't automatically put that extension in play. What you have to do to make it official and to officially extend your deadline is sending a notice indicating that the deadline for the home inspection contingency has been moved. So again, just because you've checked the box doesn't mean it automatically goes into effect. The party that wants to take advantage of the extension has to send a notice. And then for our offer, we're not having an appraisal gap and we're not doing the escalation clause. So really that's all we have to fill out. And it's a short but sweet little addenda. So that's it in a nutshell. In terms of the additional documents that you would include with your offer, so you have the offer to purchase, you have addendum A, you have addendum AC. Your buyer also needs to sign a copy of the condition report. If the house was built between 1978, there is going to be an addendum S, a lead paint addendum. Your buyer has to indicate whether or not they elect to have a lead paint inspection or to waive it. I've never seen anybody have a lead paint inspection. I'm just telling you that. Just wait. And then the other document that you would include is your buyer's pre-approval letter. Or if they are a cash buyer, I would include a proof of funds. So the offer, addendum A, addendum AC, condition report, addendum S, if applicable, and then pre-approval or a proof of funds. So that would be included in my offer packet. I would highly encourage you guys to send me your practice offer by tomorrow at 1 o'clock. I'll take a look at it and I give feedback line by line. I think it's really helpful for you guys to get into some reps, get into some practice, because the more reps you get, the better prepared you're going to be when you actually have to write an offer in the real world. So, you know, practice makes perfect. So if you have any questions, by all means, let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to send to you guys after this a link to that inspection contingency video. So if you have any free time or you want to learn a little bit more about that section of the offer, you have it at your disposal. But does anybody have questions? Nope.
You could also send a letter from the buyers, saying like your buyer, why he really wants the house.
Okay, so
Or do-
Annie,
Yeah.
I have a live in-person person here, Annie. So Annie said you could also send a letter, including or indicating like why your buyer loves the house. You can, but buyer love letters can be a little dicey. You want to make sure that the letter only talks about the house. It doesn't reveal anything about the buyer, because it could create implicit bias when the seller reads it. Meaning, let's say my buyer writes, we love this house because it's down the street from the church that we go to. And maybe the seller was like, what? I'm not giving this house to a Catholic. I don't know. I'm just making this up. But you have to be very careful that there is no way somebody could come back and indicate, well, there was implicit bias and that helped a seller make a decision one way or another. So tread lightly. I wrote a letter when I bought my house. And we really tried to focus in on like features of the home. So heads up on it. Okay. Looks like no questions, which is great. Love that. Love that for us. We are really living life right now. We're done at 1:57. Please send me your practice offer. I hope I get it from you ladies.